Welcome everyone, Costin here with a deck building guide for Broken Arrow as the United States. Generally speaking, with regards to deck building in these kind of games, so if you're looking at Warno, if you're looking at Red Dragon, Steel Division, etc., you can either specialize a deck for a particular role, infantry, tanks, air, or you can try and be more versatile, but you're not really going to be able to excel in any specific role. Now, my perspective on the subject is simple. If you're playing on your own as a solo player, it is best to be versatile because you cannot rely on random players covering for any of your deficiencies. So if you're focusing on, say, purely infantry as an example, or purely air, and then you're expecting your teammates to cover for you because you don't have tanks, then that's going to end up costing you quite a few games. It can work out really well, but it is going to be a tricky situation. Now, of course, there are some kinds of units that we want to focus on more than others. So, in terms of specializations, what I would go as a beginner would be with an armor brigade, largely because of the Bradleys, not the tanks themselves. But Bradleys are amazing, so an armor brigade for the United States, and then either a special operations forces, so SOCOM, or airborne infantry. You could also go with Marines. Marines are kind of jack of all trades. They have a bit of everything available to them, though they're not excelling in any particular role. So personally, I would go tank brigade and special operations forces. The SOCOM is largely for air power and helicopter power, as well as some infantry. The tank brigade is obviously for armored vehicles and the tanks. So, with building a deck, let's start with air power. Now, you can obviously use planes for strategic bombing, close air support, air to ground, or air to air. Unless you're playing with at least one other person that you can rely on to have your back, the close air support role is something that you're going to find to be tricky to pull off on your own as a solo player, because you would need support from your team. You need support from your team to protect your aircraft. In the air, you need ground-to-air support, so SAM systems. You'd also ideally want artillery suppressing the enemy at various points, so suppressing their air defenses. Yeah, relying on that in a pug game is probably not going to work. So from my view, with regards to this, it is best if you instead focus on air-to-air with your own air power. And this is the reason I chose SOCOM, the Special Operations, because they have the F-22. So the F-22, really good jet for air-to-air, and armed with a bunch of long-range missiles. So these are expensive, to be certain. They're very expensive, but an F-22, a single F-22, can probably give you air dominance on its own. Two of them, and I'd recommend having two of them. You can either use just one and have one as a backup in case it gets shot down, or have two if you just want to gain that air power very quickly. But F-22 armed with long-range missiles, so they aim 260, and you could go full-on aim 260s, or just go to aim 260s to aim 120s over here, as I've chosen. That's going to be a question of points. That is going to be very useful. But of course, you don't just want pure air-to-air. You want some hybrids as well, or a distraction. And this is the great thing about SOCOM, because they do have an excellent distraction, and a fairly cheap one considering everything. So you look at many planes in this game, they're pretty expensive. The one thing that isn't so expensive is the AC-130. So an AC-130 by default is a very cheap plane. Even when you equip it with all manner of missiles, Stormbreaker missiles, Griffin missiles, it's still cheaper than most planes if you want to go down that path. The important thing is this is something the enemy cannot ignore. The reason they can't ignore it is if you ignore an AC-130 entering your airspace, that thing is going to blow up a significant portion of your strong points. So this is a great bait for enemy players. Like, it's cheaper than most planes. It's pretty durable, all things considered, because you look at its HP, right? So it's got more HP than most other planes in the game, so it's fairly durable. It doesn't have the best defenses, it's not stealth, etc., but it is very, very good at providing a great distraction and forcing the enemy to engage it. And when they are engaging it, you can mark their anti-air positions for elimination, or if they're sending in jets against you, you can eliminate those jets, lure them into a trap, and blow them up with SAM systems and F-22s. So having one of these spookies is going to be great. Then we can talk about the F-35. So in this case, I can only afford one F-35, and the main purpose of this F-35 is not to deal with air targets, but to deal with ground targets. So what I would install on it would be an anti-radiation missile. Is generally going to be tricky to pull off suppression of air defenses, especially with only one jet, but it can be useful sometimes. You could go without it if you want to. And then to have either cruise missiles or guided munitions, all those kind of things in a situation. When it comes to building a battle group, you do have those two specializations to choose. And in any particular role, so air in this case, you can go up to 10% higher than the limit. So over here, I can go just a bit higher with regards to how many things I can have here. In fact, I might be able to switch. No, I can't switch those F-22s there. So it is a balancing act between these kind of things. But I could just, just install one GPU right here. It's the most expensive thing, but it can do quite a bit of damage. I could also just go with 2 air-to-ground munitions on the thing. Though, of course, I am pushing things very hard. That's going to be your decision. Do you think that there's any value in anti-radiation missiles, or do you just want that greater air-to-ground support? But remember, you're typically not going to be able to pull it off most of the time. You could also just go with MRAMs over here for the F-35 to give it some kind of air defense capability, just point out. But it does have some of these, it does have one of these by default, so, or some of these by default, so keep that aspect in mind. Planes do have like some baseline munitions available to them by default. Now, helicopters. You have scouting helicopters, you have transport helicopters of various types, of big cargo haulers, stealth or smaller, more nimble, even stealth helicopters, and attack helicopters. Here's my view on the subject with regards to helicopters. A scout helicopter of some kind of description, or a smaller helicopter that would be dedicated to seeing the enemy, can be really good, especially if it's nimble. Like a killer egg, for instance. Yes, I know, hilarious name. Or MH60 DAP. So you do have that choice. And what you can do on these small helicopters, you can use them they're pretty cheap. So helicopters can be easily shot down. So the value proposition over here is that you can install a bunch of anti-tank missiles on these AH-6s, so these little birds. You can install a bunch of anti-tank missiles and use these guys for air-to-ground attack. Guided rockets, AIM missiles. I would not equip AIM missiles most of the time on helicopters unless the helicopter itself has some level of durability, which little birds obviously don't have. Guided rockets, kind of tricky affair. Usually I wouldn't use them. Like, if you want to use an attack helicopter, the main thing you want to use them for is hunting down an enemy vehicle. So miniguns, guided rockets, etc., not necessarily that useful. What about Guardians? What about dedicated attack helicopters? Well, they can do a lot of damage, but most of the time, the problem with attack helicopters is that there's so many ways they can be shot down. They can be shot down from the air if you bring them to a high enough altitude that their long-range missiles would be effective. They're big enough, like you look at a Guardian, it's really big as a helicopter, or even a Viper is big enough to be a big-ass target, and expensive, keep that in mind, so it's a question of cost. From my point of view, attack helicopters don't really work a lot of the time, from my perspective. I would have some of them, but I would have something like a Comanche, something that has some degree of survivability, and also just some degree So over here, you know, we would go with a Comanche, and I would just get 2 Comanche helicopters over here. So stealth helicopters, light, nimble. It doesn't have the same firepower, but given the survival rates of helicopters in this game, you're not going to keep them alive for a very, very long time. Now, beyond that, what I would also pick up would be a big transport as well. The reason I would go with a big transport like an Osprey or an Mi-26 is because sometimes, and actually a lot of the times, you can get away with using something like this if you're flying at low altitude, so you have those 2 altitude levels. You can use this to transport a lot of units. Be careful, because you're obviously putting a lot of points in one vehicle, but it can be incredibly useful to get cargo, to get all kinds of things available. Then we can also use something like a Chinook, right? So smaller a bit, you know, just 1 Chinook, can have some weapons, but mostly the value over here of a Chinook is just going to be able to transport, you know, lighter loads, but it's more, you know, a Chinook has more, actually it has more capacity than an Osprey. What the hell am I talking about? So it can transport big loads, right? But keep in mind, it's like that kind of risk that you will have with using something like this. So bear that aspect in mind. And weapons, it's not really going to be great. But yeah, mainly with helicopters, regardless of which ones you go for, I would have a limited number of attack helicopters. Oh, I actually do have a decent number of them. But little killer eggs are not attack helicopters. I do wish to emphasize that. They're more like, I would view their primary role to be like harassing helicopters and kind of a bit of a scouting, though their scouting capability is not necessarily going to be great, but they're small enough, cheap enough, you know, disposable helicopters, if you will. Most helicopters are very damn expensive, so keep that in mind when you're using them. That's one of the problems with regards to using them for air support. Like, you want helicopters to scout, you want helicopters to transport troops, and in the most extreme situations, you might use them, you know, as a firefighter. So if the enemy has an armored breakthrough in an area, but they haven't moved their defenses in that area, you can use attack helicopters in that situation. I would not use attack helicopters to go attack, actually, because that's a good way of losing a lot of points very quickly. So that's my perspective on this. So mainly transport, recon, getting your infantry across the map quickly enough. Support. There's artillery, but first, when we're talking about support, you should focus on air defenses. So I would have 2 of these Patriot missiles, for instance, or S-300s, with more missiles per unit, because you're going to have a limited number of them, so might as well just give them a couple more missiles so they don't run out of ammunition. They can shoot down a lot more things very quickly. But this is long range. Don't worry about self-defense or armor package or anything like that. The best air defense is the one that's not detected. If an air defense is detected, it's going to get destroyed very damn quickly. So don't bother spending the extra points on, you know, a grenade launcher on it or armor. It's cheap, but still. I would have 2 of these in a battle group, and you can either use both of them at once or have one in reserve, right? So in case you lose the one, you can call in another one and not have that window of vulnerability where the enemy can just, you know, potentially gain air dominance for a bit against you. But it's not enough to just have Patriots. You would also want shorter range air defenses. So this is where you gotta make a choice. Like, having 2 Patriots or long range, that's generally recommended. You would also want some transport vehicles. These are cheap. They can transport a good amount of stuff on them, so 5,000 cargo each. Don't worry about self-defense weapons. Like, you could do so, but they're going to be destroyed very, very quickly, right? So, you know, just having these guys to transport stuff, a lot of stuff, you know, across the battle very quickly is generally useful. But then we have to talk about shorter range air defenses, and this is where you might have a choice, because usually you are going to want to have some kind of artillery in your army, so you got to make that choice. Do you want shorter range air defenses? You want long range, but do you want shorter range air defenses to potentially intercept any missiles in particular? So for instance, you could get two of these vehicles right here, in this case. In some cases you might get more, and then get 2 to linebackers with stingers, maybe some extra armor, upgraded engine, all that kind of stuff. But here's the kicker: you do this. If you go this hard with so many air defenses, you're probably going to end up screwing yourself in terms of artillery. So if there is something you might want to cut out, would be like you would want a minigun type, like a Alain gun, because this would be really good at at having an anti-aircraft gun, closer to the front line, reasonably cheap enough that you can bring them. And then I would focus on having artillery. Now, having both kinds of artillery, both tube artillery and MLRS, is generally speaking the most ideal situation. But you may not have enough points for both of them. So you either choose or you sacrifice in one area for another. Now, MLRS can do a devastating amount of damage against an enemy. But they do take a good amount of reload. They can be easily spotted by the enemy. And by the way, speaking about HIMARS, a HIMARS is basically M270, but with like one of these, with just one of these cargo or missile grouping on them as opposed to two. You could go with cheaper tube artillery and just go for saturation, or you can go ballistic missiles, high explosive cluster warheads. That's your decision. Tube artillery in general, generally speaking, is going to be pretty useful to have. So instead of going with MLRS, you could go with tube artillery. Tube artillery can get longer range, can be very versatile in a battlefield, and they can have a far higher degree of accuracy compared to MLRS. So keep that kind of aspect in mind when you're talking about the balance here. So it is a balance. I would focus on air defense, certainly, but how much you want to focus, you could even cut these vehicles and let's just say, we go with one MLRS right here, and we're just at the point limit. That is your choice. How far do you want to go on this subject? That's going to be up to you. If you want to cut down one Patriot, again, your choice. Personally, I'd probably go without the MLRS and just pick up this. I find myself to be quite fond of tube artillery as opposed to MLRS. MLRS is very, very useful, grid square removal, all that kind of stuff. But, the cost of it is not something, to sneeze at. So for instance, over here, I could afford one ATACMS as an example. So this could be one grouping, but there's all kinds of choices over here. Again, my personal preference would be more tube artillery. So I would even go with, 3 of these as opposed to having any MLRS, but personal decision on the subject. Vehicles. Tanks. You want tanks. Something like an M10 Booker is now worth it, and with tanks, you kind of want to go expensive, because if you're not going to go expensive, tanks are going to be pretty expensive regardless, and they're not going to have the firepower or survivability if you cheap out on them. So, go full on for the expensive stuff. So in this case, we got 2 M1A2 V3s and 3 or even 4 V2s over here. Although you would probably want to up-armor them. So armoring them increases their survivability. Don't think of Tusk armor as necessarily helping out that much against missiles, because it's not. It's just going to give you that kind of extra edge. And what you want tanks for is to annihilate APCs in close range. But you need to have some kind of active protection, because otherwise a lot of APCs and IFVs do have the ability of using anti-tank missiles. So if you don't have a way to protect against those, you're going to get a bunch of scrap metal very, very quickly. So that's why it's very important to have active protection, trophy, or Afghanet, however it's called for the Russians. Probably there's an extra name over there, like Iron Fist, Afghanet, whatever. But trophy, really good. And it's your decision, how you want to balance it out. Do you want the extra protection over here? That's going to be your personal decision. But I would not cheapen on tanks, because a bunch of cheap tanks are just going to be target practice for freaking infantry. Whereas these tanks would be able to withstand a lot. They might not kill everything, but they can take a heck of a beating, and that's going to be important. Quality is important. Like, if you want to cheapen out on stuff, don't cheapen out on long-range air defenses. Don't cheapen out on long-range jets or tanks, but you can cheapen out in other areas like supplies, helicopters, etc. That would be my view. So we're pushing past the limit over here, and I might even want to reduce it a bit. You can get over 10% in any category. Now, let's talk about recon. I'll do infantry last. This is one of the reasons the armor brigade is really good, because not only do you have things like cavalry scouts, but you also get Bradleys. And Bradleys are phenomenal vehicles. They're fairly durable. Like, they're almost as durable as freaking tanks. They don't have the firepower of tanks, but they can defeat tanks unless those tanks have active protection. So you can get that. You can call in IFVs on your own. So in this case, I would go with 4 cavalry scouts with 4 Bradleys, and each of these is carrying a javelin, so pretty good stuff right there. And you would also be able to use the vehicles on their own. Then we have Green Berets, for instance. I would use that. And with Green Berets, I would go with sniper rifles, so they're scouts, keep that in mind. And get some vehicles over here, just 2 of these, maybe 3 of them. Depends on how many points I have by the end of it. But yeah, just got a bunch of cavalry scouts over there. The rest, you can get stealth helicopters. This is one of the reasons for special forces. They have stealth transport helicopters that they can use. And these kind of helicopters are enormously useful because they can get in close to the enemy, so you can use these things. To really move your guys behind enemy lines. And for instance, I would also use Ranger Recon with standoff weapons. Close quarters, yeah, they can be useful in close quarters, but I would rather have standoff with these guys, just to have greater capability against tanks. That's my view on the subject. So that's some of the recon over there, and we can actually use more. We can use more pararescue, or we can go with more Green Berets if we want to right here. Yeah, so we're still over the limit. That leaves infantry, but it's up to you how far you want to go with regards to how many scouts and all that. So probably I would just cut out some of these guys because we want a good amount of infantry. And the reason we want a good amount of infantry is, well, we can get special forces. So these guys are going to be really good with standoff capability, all that kind of stuff. And they can also use those same kind of helicopters. But here's the win here. Like Delta Force, yeah, really good stuff. But the win here is with regards to fighting vehicles, IFVs. So the way you primarily gain Bradleys is through here. And again, Bradleys are really good. So you do want quality in certain areas, so tanks and all that, but you also want mass. Well, Bradleys are cheap enough that you can mass them even when fully upgraded. And a fully upgraded Bradley is gonna be a pretty nightmarish thing to freaking deal with, I gotta tell you. So you would get a bunch of these units, and what I would not cheapen out on would be AA missiles and infantry. So having some Stingers would be really good, so you can get a really good amount of these guys right here in this case. So with Stingers, you can deal with helicopters like that. This is your primary anti-helicopter tool. So having a couple of these, spreading them around, would be really good. You can also get engineers. So engineers can have different weapons, but I'm not really too sold on the Bradley over here because it's like, yeah, it does have, it's not necessarily the best Bradley option, but it's still a Bradley, so it can be extremely useful. But yeah, you can just mass all kinds of units right here. So maybe a couple of these guys. But yeah, we just don't want to necessarily go too freaking crazy over here. Now you can see that I'm over the point limit. So In this case, I would probably just reduce some units elsewhere and just get more units. Like, having a lot of Bradleys, that is a lot of freaking Bradleys, right? It would be tricky enough to defeat this. And yeah, just having, you know, anti-material rifles, all that kind of stuff, can be very, very useful. So this is a kind of balanced deck. Like, so you got so you got all kinds of capabilities here. You have good infantry against infantry. You got your cavalry scouts for the sake of dealing with enemy vehicles. That's the reason I went for 4 of them right there. Although maybe I should go with fewer of them and just get, you know, more freaking vehicles, right? Although you can always use other vehicles to you know, call in over there if you want. So I would just probably try and pull as much as of this off. Yeah, there we go. So 3 of them. This would be a fairly balanced deck. Like, you're lacking in terms of kind of like strike capability with your aircraft. You have a good way of dominating the skies, good transport capability, pretty decent tube artillery capability, good tanks, good power over there. So first armored, right? But I've used a deck like this is similar to one I have in Old Ironsides, just a couple of difference. Oh, I did forget to mention something. Actually, that is on me. One of the things that you actually do want to have is drones. So I'm just going to take down some of these guys. Having a bunch of drones can be very, very useful. So I think I'm just going to take some of these helicopters away, or at least one of these. So drone-wise, having a bunch of these for recon purposes, or also just, you know, the kind of capability of just like using them for attack purposes can be extremely useful. Though keep in mind, you know, the point situation is a factor that you gotta, you know, you gotta balance things out. But having drones, at least some drones, 2, 3, 4 drones, for the sake of scouting, like, very useful. Drones are relatively cheap. They're pretty good scouts. They have a pretty good sight range over here, both of them, like the Reaper or the Sentinel or whatever drone you're talking about. You could also get a bunch of, like, you could also get some vehicles to help you with scouting, but bear in mind, like, most of these scouting vehicles are not really great for scouting, and besides, you will have them as part of the infantry units over there. So this is the kind of deck I would use in this in multiplayer personally, just as beginning. You can go with more specialized decks, but I'd recommend playing at least with one guy, one friend that you can rely on, and, you know, you decide, okay, I'm gonna focus on infantry, you're gonna focus on air power. That kind of decision is what you want to, you know, discuss and decide and all that kind of stuff, right? With regards to how you're going to handle that kind of situation. And yeah, just don't be afraid of, you know, changing a couple of things potentially over here, you know, just to try and maximize your points. Anyway, that's all I had to say. Christine signing.